for coming. My name is Warren, and we're in part 5 of 6 of the lecture series on constitutional law in the United States. Today we're looking at a specific topic of protesting and privacy. It turns out to be a really big topic, or a number of topics. So we're going to try and pare it down to some essential concepts. To put this in context, last week we talked about the framework of rights in state and federal law, and specifically the 14th Amendment, what that meant with due process, equal protection. I apologize, I wasn't totally on my game, and I should have remembered that the 5th Amendment also has an equal protection clause. That applies to the federal government, but kind of a bit of a refresher, and this is a little deeper than we need to go, but because of the due process clause in the 5th Amendment, the 14th Amendment that applies to the states also applies to the federal government. And because of the due process clause in the 14th Amendment that applies to the states, the courts have said that almost all of the Bill of Rights also apply to the states. So initially, we would have said the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which is going to be a big part of our topic today, only restricts the federal government. Right? But with the 14th Amendment and the due process clause in the 14th Amendment, the courts have said, well, part of the due process right to life, liberty, and property is this free speech right, freedom of assembly right, freedom of petition right, religious rights and everything in the First Amendment. So even though the 14th Amendment says this applies to the states, and the First Amendment says Congress can't do this, meaning the federal government, the courts have said, well, the 14th Amendment incorporates the First Amendment and applies it to the states. So the First Amendment applies against the state, the local, and the federal government. Right? Any part of government in the United States cannot violate a person's First Amendment right. Well, it can, and it does all the time, but, in theory, it can't. We're talking about theory. So, to get started, we are talking about protesting and privacy, which are kind of hot issues. This was a by request topic today. It doesn't necessarily have to fit into the framework of constitutional law, but it is talking about one of the foundational rights in the U.S. Constitution and also in our state constitution as well. So we're just going to start with number 1 and we'll return to number 0 later on. So the First Amendment. And the First Amendment, just 1A, reads, and I think it's important to just look at the text of it and then deconstruct that a little bit. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now initially you might read and say, Congress shall make no law. Wow, that is no law. But the courts haven't read it that way. So don't worry, Congress can make lots of laws respecting the establishment of religion, prohibiting free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press, the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. Congress can do that. It's not a blanket prohibition of those things according to the courts, even though the text of the First Amendment read expressly would say that. One thing to note is that in Washington's Constitution, we have some similar provisions, because today we're just talking about the speech, the assembly, and the petition parts of the First Amendment. I didn't include the religion clauses as well. So we're not talking about those, even though those are part of the First Amendment. And there's a whole lot that could be said and discussed about those. But in Washington's Constitution, Article 1, Section 4, includes the petition and assembly rights. The right of petition and of the people to peaceably to assemble for the common good shall never be abridged. Again, pretty absolute language. And then in Article 1, Section 5 of the Washington Constitution, every person may freely speak, write, and publish on all subjects, being responsible for the abuse of that right. So we notice right away that there's a difference in the language in the Washington Constitution and the federal Constitution and how these rights are expressed. And the courts have looked at them So the Washington Supreme Court has interpreted parts of speech, assembly, and petition to be more protective of people's rights and civil liberties than the federal First Amendment. And we talked last week, although didn't get as into it as we could have because of lack of time, but we talked last week about how the federal Constitution forms the floor, the minimum rights that people have. And the state constitutions can go above that floor. So the federal Constitution says, you have this right of free speech, that's in the First Amendment. In Washington State, our state constitution, Article 1, Section 5, says you also have this free speech in the state constitution, and it's more expansive, according to our state Supreme Court, than the federal First Amendment on some of those grounds. We can get into the details of that, but not in the next hour and a half, unfortunately. And for today's purpose, while I'm throwing in the Washington Constitution stuff, we're not going to be talking specifically about the state constitution. So I'm going to keep it on the federal constitution. But remember, hey, in Washington State, our constitution might actually give us more protective rights under those clauses than what the federal constitution provides. So something to note as we go forward. So what's this about? In 1964, the U.S. Supreme Court said, you know, what this First Amendment stuff is all about. And he said the ability to criticize government and government officers is the central meaning of the First Amendment. So that ability to criticize the government, that ability to say that the government is wrong, the ability to demand a change from the government is at the heart of this. And this First Amendment language came out of the American Revolution. It came out of a time when people were not able to protest against the government, were not able to do these things that they say, hey, this is really important, this is the First Amendment, right? This is first for a reason. And so that ability to criticize the government is part of that central meaning, according to the court in 1964. But prior to that, the courts didn't always have that interpretation. So we're going to get into a little bit of the history and then move forward. But I want to just outline some key points on First Amendment law today. So kind of what it means today. So one of the key things is in Section 1B, which is this difference between content-based laws and content-neutral laws. Is the government restricting speech because of what the speech actually says? Versus is the government just restricting speech for some other reason, not because of what it says? So there's a difference there, and the courts have said that when the government restricts speech based on content, so a content-based law, then that's reviewed under what we call strict scrutiny. So strict scrutiny, you remember from last week, kind of happened fast, it might hit you like a brick in the head, was where the government has to show a compelling government interest, and that interest has to be narrowly tailored to, the law has to be narrowly tailored to achieving that interest. So it's a very high standard. The burden is against the government. If the government has to show strict scrutiny, it's going to be tough to do that. It's not impossible, but it's difficult. I think last week we looked at the Korematsu decision, Japanese internment or confinement of people with Japanese American ancestry, even U.S. citizens, as an example where the court did say, hey, that passes strict scrutiny under wartime. That's one of the only times that sort of thing has happened in the court. On the other hand, content-neutral laws are reviewed under intermediate scrutiny. So we have strict scrutiny, it's like the highest review standard, compelling, narrowly tailored, and then there's at the very bottom this other standard called rational basis review, which is the government just needs a legitimate reason to make the law, and it needs to be related in some way, reasonably related to the action that the government took. In between is intermediate scrutiny. And intermediate scrutiny, now, people are talking about intermediate scrutiny plus or intermediate scrutiny minus. There's a lot of different forms of intermediate scrutiny. But it's not a compelling government purpose. That would be strict scrutiny. but it's more than just a legitimate government purpose. Usually it's an important government interest to get intermediate scrutiny. And then there has to be a stronger connection between what the government's interest is and what the law does. So the point is that we're not just looking at rational basis review. We've got a higher standard. The burden's on the government to prove the legitimacy of its law, to prove the constitutionality of its law. Under 1C, there's another principle with First Amendment law, which is that unduly vague or overbroad laws regulating speech are unconstitutional. So the government needs to get specific in what it's doing, how it's regulating speech. It can't just be a broad law that doesn't really explain what's going on. These are principles that we have today, not necessarily principles from the past. These have been built mostly over the 20th century. 1D is a really critical one, and we're going to talk about this a bit later, which is this idea that prior restraints of speech are strongly disfavored. So what's a prior restraint? It's where the government is preventing people from speaking before they have spoken. So if you're going to go out and you're going to exercise your free speech rights and speak, do you have to go ask the government to do that? Hey, we'd like, excuse me, President Trump, we'd like permission to protest. Right? You have to do that?
Well, you have to get, someplace you have to get permits like from the city because they think it's a litter a litter problem and so forth.
So sometimes people say you need to get a permit. A permit is an example of prior restraint on speech. So we're going to get into that and when and where and why does that happen. But that's important to remember that you don't need anyone's permission to protest, to peaceably assemble, to petition the government for redress of grievances, to exercise the free speech. If you needed the government's permission, how effectively would that work as an ability to criticize government and government officers? Right? That wouldn't work very well. And the courts understand that most of the time.
Is ending net neutrality a restraint of speech?
Net neutrality, I don't know where the laws are on that, and so I'm not going to get into it. Net neutrality, though, just for people to understand, is this idea that right now, I think it's still right now, maybe it's changed already. You can go online and basically the connection to any server is more or less as fast as it allows. The idea of that's net neutrality, and I might not be explaining it very well. The alternative, and I'm not sure exactly what the alternative is the idea that some servers would get a faster connection, other servers would get a slower connection.
Depending on how much they pay.
Based on stuff like that. So,
it can be what kind of speech you're seeking out.
Yeah, it does seem like it implicates free speech because it's content-based.
It can be.
It could be content-based.
Right.
Yeah, so if I was involved in that area of law, this would be something that I'd be looking to, but I don't know the details of how the courts have looked at that. But there's definitely a free speech implication to that neutrality. Can I take your question?
The recent issue with end culture and the previous issue with Miles University of California, Berkeley, where they're going to ban her speech because of safety concerns. At least that's one argument. Her argument probably was that they're going to try to ban content. Other people say, well, she's hate speech, so we don't want her. How does that, without getting into the weeds and all that?
Yeah, so this question of people going to speak and being prohibited from speaking, and is that safety concerns, is that not? Let's get to that at the end. Or specifically not the end, but let's get to that after section 4 or so, if that's okay. Because I think we'll get to that in some ways.
This concept of prior restraint is kind of intriguing to me, and I'm not sure I understand. We had sort of an example of that earlier this year in our little foreign exam. And it was around January in the heat of the fluoride discussion and unrest going on. The city council said signs, profanity, insulting behavior, loud voice were not allowed. And a number of people argued that was infringing upon their free right to speech. On the other hand, did that come under prior restraint? And is a body like Port Angeles City Council, or any city council, or anybody similar to that, can they set rules ahead of time that falls in this prior constraint?
So I would think of that as a prior restraint, whereas a government sets rules on when, where people can speak and have signs and that sort of thing. Just because prior restraints are strongly disfavored doesn't mean they're not allowed. So again, I'm going to say let's get to that after we talk about where speech happens, and the specific term that you'll hear all the time in this context is time, place, and manner. So does the government have a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction, and that sort of thing. So we're going to get into that framework and understanding some of what goes into that consideration. But if it's okay, let's get to that question later, and hopefully I'll kind of get to some of the nuances. And the specifics of it, I'm not going to have a clear answer on, but the framework we're looking at it, we will cover. So prior restraints of speech are strongly disfavored. And then also just to throw in there, even though it's not in the text of the First Amendment, Section 1E here mentions that the First Amendment also protects freedom of association. So in this case, NAACP versus Alabama from 1958, the state of Alabama was trying to get the membership roster for the NAACP. And the NAACP was resisting that, and the U.S. Supreme Court said that association, choosing to associate and choosing to keep that confidential from the state, is protected under the First Amendment. So don't just turn over your membership logs, whatever anyone asks. All right, so that's kind of a general framework of the First Amendment. We're going to get into a couple specific issues. First, we're going to get into where certain kinds of speech are less protected. So, hey, if it's protected, it falls in this framework, content-based, content-neutral, prior restraints, unduly vague, all that. But some kinds of speech just don't get to be protected, even though they technically are speech. And then we're going to get into this question, which a number of folks have brought up, of when and where do people get to speak, and when does the government get to put restrictions on that speech. Finally, we'll move into stuff that's more related to privacy and some of the impacts more currently in the last 16 years around speech and privacy and those intersections. So there are certain forms of speech that the courts have said just, yeah, they're speech, they're technically speech, but they're not really protected, or they're less protected under the First Amendment. So these are referred to in Section 2 as less protected speech. And the general categories are incitement of illegal activity, which we're going to cover specifically here because that has to do with protesting. But other less protected speech categories include fighting words and provocation of hostile audiences, obscenity and sexually oriented speech, defamatory speech, like libel and slander, and conduct that communicates, and commercial speech. So there's a whole lot of different categories that the court has said, yeah, it's speech, but we're not going to protect it the same way as other forms of speech. We're specifically interested here in what some people would refer to as political speech, because when you're talking about protesting, you're really talking about political speech. And the courts have often said that political speech is the highest form of protected speech. And that goes back to New York Times versus Sullivan, where this idea of the central meaning of the First Amendment is to criticize government and government officials. So political speech is usually more protected speech, not less protected speech. But historically, the courts have allowed the government, and when I say the government, I mean the legislative branch of government, so Congress, as well as the executive branch of government, like the president, to restrict speech. So let's start with examples from World War I. And this is where some of the First Amendment concepts that we are familiar with today began. And one of them is this idea of the clear and present danger. And this is this famous line, and when we get to it, everyone will say, oh yeah, I've heard that. So In 1917, Congress had enacted a law called the Espionage Act, and one of the things it did was it criminalized willfully causing or attempting to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States. And it's still in the laws today. USC is United States Code. So this is 18 USC section 2388. So you can go and find that language, and it's still there in the laws of the United States today. So during World War I, it was a fairly unpopular war. There were, I think, 350,000 people who refused to get conscripted or drafted. And so there was a lot of this willfully causing or attempting to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, or refusal of duty. And one person who was doing that, his name was Schenck, and he had some pamphlets that said, hey, the 13th Amendment prohibits slavery, and so, you know, getting conscripted is kind of like slavery, isn't it? So you should resist that. And he was giving them out to people who'd been conscripted into the U.S. military. And he was found to be in violation of the Espionage Act. And so the court, you know, he obviously appealed and said, hey, free speech, right? Because I'm advocating political change, I'm advocating, you know, I'm using my free speech. I'm petitioning for redress, I'm doing all that good stuff, right? That's what I'm supposed to do. I have that right under the U.S. Constitution. At the bottom of page 1, we get some of the key words from the court. This is Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, again, talking about whether Schenck has a free speech protection for his activities. Holmes says, we admit that in many places and in ordinary times, meaning not during war, the defendants, in saying all that was said in the circular, which is their anti-conscription pamphlet distributed to men who have been called and accepted for military service, would have been within their constitutional rights. So in other times, hey, that's fine to talk about how conscription is like slavery and that stuff. But the character of every act depends upon the circumstances in which it is done. The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing panic. The question in every case is whether the words used are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evil that Congress has a right to prevent. It is a question of proximity and degree. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are of such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court would regard them as protected by any constitutional right. So that's where we get that yelling, fire in a crowded theater line. That's also where we get the clear and present danger line from this opinion by Holmes back in 1919. And the defendants there did not obviously win their appeal. And so they went to jail for distributing pamphlets to people who they thought shouldn't be serving in the military. So that clear and present danger test continued for a while. It had some different forms. Into the 1950s, the U.S. Supreme Court continued to uphold criminal convictions for activities that were somewhat similar to what happened in Schenck. The Smith Act, so page 2, subsection B, this case, Dennis versus United States, concerned the Smith Act, and the Smith Act was more targeted against people who the U.S. government were calling communists, who the U.S. government claimed were trying to advocate for the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. And so even membership in an organization that would have been under that category, according to the U.S., was illegal and criminal. And so, even into 1951, the U.S. Supreme Court continued to say that what Congress did, in this case the Smith Act, was lawful, and that people who were joining organizations specifically targeted against the Communist Party, this was the McCarthy era, they were in violation of the law, and the First Amendment did not protect them. So that was 1951. If we consider back on page 1, the freedom of association, NAACP versus Alabama, was 1958. That, a lot changed between 1951 and 1958. Yeah.
So I don't understand how that has to do with the time, place, and manner. There was no war going on at that time. So what was it about the time, place, and manner in 1951 that they felt justified?
Yeah. So what was it about 1951 that the court in Dennis versus United States felt like they could uphold the Smith Act? And we'd have to go back and read that case and see what was the court specifically saying and thinking. But I think it's also a lesson for us of how the court can be a reflection of the times rather than an upholder of an objective truth and the real meaning of the Constitution and that sort of thing. So I don't remember specifically how the court justified its decision in Dennis versus United States, but it's there in the opinion. And if you want to look any of these up, just type in Dennis versus United States and then 341 US 494, and that's going to give it to you. And the text of any of these cases is now available on a number of places online. What's harder to find from a public research perspective without having access to databases or without being able to get into the law library is how that case has been looked at subsequently. So how have courts after 1951 looked at Dennis versus United States? And that's harder to get without the legal research database access. So unfortunately, we have private access to the law as well. Yeah, question?
When it says one nation is at war, many things might be said. Is there any implication in there that it's a declared war, as opposed to, say, the Korean War or other wars that we're familiar with?
Yeah, I don't know if Holmes was thinking along those lines when it was 1919. So we might get to that a little bit now, but this test, the clear and present danger test, has generally gone away at this point. That the courts have said that, well, that it's too wishy-washy and unduly vague, overbroad. Like, hello, you have rights until the government says, no, now we're really at war, and now we can't have anyone have any rights. Courts have said, no, we're not going to really let that fly. So, I'm not really sure of a specific answer there, but yeah, it does raise this question. If Holmes' test was still the test, basically Holmes is deferring to the executive branch of government and saying, hey, if you tell us we're at war, then we don't mind if people's constitutional rights mean less than if you tell us we're at peace. That's what Holmes is basically saying. So to get to the modern test then, kind of where are we at with this question of less protected speech? Specifically this area of law, these cases have been looking at what the courts call incitement to illegal activity, right? The idea of overthrowing the government by violence is illegal activity. And so the courts have said, well, is that protected speech? Is that not protected speech? So we're looking within that framework. What eventually happened into basically the 1960s was a test that is more or less the test today. This is page 2, subsection C, and the Brandenburger test. So this is a case where there were some Ku Klux Klan members. They invited a reporter to come to one of their rallies, and the reporter reported on it, and the Klan members got prosecuted, and the court said, yeah, they weren't doing anything that didn't violate their free speech rights protected them. So the test is an individual can be convicted for incitement only if it is proven that there was a likelihood of imminent illegal conduct and if the speech was intended at causing imminent illegal conduct. Right? So even those people were talking about things that were illegal, there wasn't a likelihood of imminent illegal conduct. Right? So the speech wasn't intended at causing imminent illegal conduct. So, there's a difference the court would say between saying, we're going to kill all the people of color, which obviously is illegal, and doing it in a context where it's actually going to happen imminently, and the speaker intends for that to happen imminently. So there's a difference now between the kind of the rhetorical flourishes that people might take and the actual incitement to illegal activity. And the court's now saying, yeah, no, just because you said it doesn't mean you're actually inciting people to illegal activity. So the Brandenburger test is more protective of people's First Amendment right, their right to speak and not be accused of inciting to illegal activity. Even if you look at our words, and well, technically, isn't that? But the court said, no, it has to be imminent. There has to be an intent for it to actually lead to imminent illegal conduct. So there's a couple examples here to kind of flush this out, because this is more or less the test today. So Brandenburg versus Ohio, 1969, that protects the KKK rally, the Constitution protects form of speech. Hess versus Indiana, 1973. This is where there was a demonstration. Somebody said, we'll take the effing streets later. The police had broken up the demonstration and arrested this person for incitement. And the court said, no, that was rhetorical, there was no imminent illegal conduct, and the speech wasn't intended to cause imminent illegal conduct. Another case, NAACP versus Claiborne Hardware. This is 1982 case, but the case comes from a boycott in, I believe, the 70s. The defendant stated during the boycott, this is somebody saying in the boycott, if we catch any of you going into any of them racist stores, we're going to break your damn neck. Right? And the court said, well, that's constitutionally protected since, according to the court, quote, mere advocacy of the use of force or violence does not remove speech from the protection of the First Amendment. So that's more or less where we are now. That advocacy is not itself unprotected speech. It's not less protected speech. It's essentially, to talk about these frameworks of less protected normal speech and more protected, more of this language has moved into political speech away from being incitement speech. And we look at this history, and if we look at the history of policing and things like red squads, for example, which are police units specifically looking at political activists on the left, there's a strong history of using criminalization as a means of suppressing protest movements. And so generally, it's a positive thing that the courts are not going there anymore. Although we'll talk a little bit about domestic terrorism and what that means a little bit later. So, page 2, mid part of the page, places available for speech, distinctions among types of government properties, and what the government may regulate speech and teach. So the question becomes, well, where can you speak? I mean, I have free speech at my house, but so what, right? I mean, if the purpose is to petition for redress of grievances and criticize the government and criticize government officials, who cares if I'm ranting and raving in my living room about, what I read in the paper or something, right? Like, that's not really going to achieve this intent of being able to peaceably assemble and petition the government for redress of grievances. So where can I go and do that? And initially for our purposes, being the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, initially the court said, well, the government owns property, and like any property owner, it can choose how that property gets used and for what purposes that property applies. And so, you want to protest on somebody else's property? Well, you can't just go onto their property and do that. And so who cares if it's the government's property? Like, you can't just go onto somebody else's property and do something that they're not authorizing you to do on their property, can you? And that was initially the line. So 3A, a case Davis versus Massachusetts in 1897, and Alderley versus Florida, that one's actually from 1966, kind of pulling some of that old language and reviving it to some extent, which also shows the way that the courts fluctuate in what rule they apply based on the facts of the particular case. But that was the rule for quite a while. And in many ways, on certain kinds of government property, it is still the rule. So we have this concept of different kinds of forums, or fora. I'll probably say both, even though only one's correct. And those are places that the government owns. And then the question is, well, can people use those places for political speech and assembly, or can't they? And so some places, this idea that, well, the government controls the property and gets to decide what happens there, that's still the rule. And those would be called non-public fora. So places that the government owns that are not places where you can just go and exercise free speech, free assembly.
Could you give an example of that?
Does anyone here work for the government? All right, so we've got a couple of government employees. Does anyone ever come and protest in your office?
Not yet.
Not yet. Do you think they could?
No, I don't think so.
They probably can, yeah. So I can't go into the back offices at, I'll choose an example that's for neither of you. The back offices at the city clerk's or the county clerk, where they're just keeping all the records for the cases and trying to organize all the records and figuring out what's going on in court. Can't go back there and say, hey, it's government property, I'm going to protest. They call the sheriff, and the sheriff would say, you can't do that here. And I'd say, why? And the sheriff would say, I'm not sure why, but I know you can. So you can't, right? And in that case, they'd be right. I mean, that's a non-public forum. The back offices of the government building are a place where we can't just go and exercise our free speech, free assembly rights, even though that's a place that the government owns. And hey, aren't we the government? Right? But no, that's a non-public forum.
So what about if they sit in the college president's office?
Ooh, sit in the college president's office. Was it permitted?
Well, they got arrested. Doesn't mean you should get arrested.
They got arrested, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
They do get arrested.
Yeah.
And if they don't get arrested, it's just because the college decides not to press.
Yeah, so sometimes the college will say, ooh, we don't want the bad press of arresting our own students. We're going to go set up the president's office somewhere else and let the students do what they do when they sit in at the college president's office. But yeah, if they get arrested, I mean, yeah, so I could go and protest in the county clerks, and if they're ever listening to this, they're like, why is he choosing that example? But I mean, you could go and protest, but you're going to get arrested. Right? Because it's not a place where you have that right to do it. Now, I'm not saying that every time people get arrested, it's, oh, well, I guess they didn't have a free speech right or a free assembly right when they were arrested. No, I mean, people get arrested and it turned out that it was a violation of civil rights. That happens quite a bit. But in the context of non-public fora, there are parts of government property that are not public fora for speech. And so this general idea that, well, whoever controls the property owner gets to decide what happens there, that applies in non-public fora.
Well, how do you said back offices or something like that? Is what about the lobby of the courthouse or even the lobby of the clerk's office?
Let's get into some of the details before we explore some of the hypotheticals.
Okay.
Is that okay? So what the courts have said now is that certain government properties, like the streets, like central parks, I think in maybe college campuses, particularly the squares in campuses, and I'm thinking they're public campuses, sidewalks, those are public fora. These are places where communication between citizens is part of the privileges and immunities, rights, and liberties of citizens. And the courts looked often to history there and said, hey, people have come together and communicated in these spaces, and that's why there's this privilege and immunity and right to do it today. That it's not about the government owning those spaces, as it is about the history of citizens coming together and communicating in those spaces. And that's where citizens then have the right to do that today. So often the courts look at places where it was historically speech has been practiced. So that's why we get the streets, central parks, and sidewalks. These places where people have, for a long time, exercised their speech rights. And that's really key, that this is fluctuating, right? One judge says, well, that's a public forum. Another judge says, I'm not sure that people have really been using that space. And it might be contextual as well. One particular square in town might be a place where people always protest, and another place might not be. And so it's very contextual, but there's some general rules. And so basically, the streets and the parks and the sidewalks, those are clear public fora. The deeper you get into a government building, the less public fora it's going to be. The lobby, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where the lobby's going to stand. So this creates this doctrine for the courts called the fora doctrine. And it's this idea of the public forum, designated public forum, which are in between and non-public forum. And out of this comes this idea of time, place, and manner restrictions. But I think I just got ahead of myself in saying that. So this is kind of a long quote from a court, but it helps to frame it in terms of how it works. And this is a court interpreting speech on National Park Service land. And looking at, what does that mean? And I'll mention it's the DC Circuit in 2010 saying this. So it's not the US Supreme Court, it's the Circuit Court for the District of Columbia. It's a level below the US Supreme Court. And so I'll just read this and we'll look at kind of that forum doctrine in that context. So even protected speech is not equally permissible in all places and at all times. So even protected speech, right? We're not talking about less protected speech, but protected speech. Nothing in the Constitution requires the government freely to grant access to all who wish to exercise their right to free speech on every type of government property, without regard to the nature of the property or to the disruption that might be caused by the speaker's activities. So there's no blanket right to do free speech for everyone on government property. Rather, the extent of scrutiny given to a regulation of speech, in other words, how much the court will say, government, do you really have the right to restrict speech in that spot? How much, the extent of scrutiny in a regulation of speech, in effect, how we examine the directness with which it promotes the government's goals and the degree to which it burdens speech, depends on whether the regulation applies in a public or non-public forum. Traditional public fora are those places which by long tradition or by government fiat have been devoted to assembly and debate. Another type of public forum is the designated public forum, which exists when government property that has not traditionally been regarded as a public forum is intentionally opened up for that purpose. A non-public forum is, by contradistinction, public property which is not by tradition or designation a forum for public communication. So there's this distinction. Even though it's protected speech, where you're practicing, whether it's a public forum or a non-public forum, is going to determine whether the government has to allow that speech or not. So this court held that, at least with respect to those free speech areas that the National Park Service had, to the free speech areas that the National Park Service regulations must be analyzed as restrictions on speech in public forums. So when the National Park Service says, this is a free speech area, and for here there's only a handful of them, like right in front of the Park Visitor Center up there on Mount Angels Road. That's a free speech area that the park is designated. The court's saying, well, restrictions on speech in those places must be analyzed as restrictions of speech in public forums. But the court also says, we're not sure if the same analysis would apply everywhere in the national park. Because there's such a variety of land the national park manages that, it's hard to say that all those places have been places that have traditionally been places where people have gathered to communicate. Right? I mean, a national park like in Philadelphia, outside of Independence Hall, that's very different than, 3 days hike up the Elwha River in Olympic National Park. People haven't typically gone to the latter to express their grievance with the government, although maybe privately people have, but not publicly. So on page 3, we've got public forums, like the street, the sidewalk, public lands, depending on public lands, free speech zones. So we've got public forums. And so when can the government restrict your activities on those public forums? And I think this is kind of the question a number of people have been asking about. And so just to take one of the cases here, we'll start with the quote and then analyze it. The U.S. Supreme Court said in 1992 that although there is a heavy presumption against the validity of a prior restraint, the court has recognized that government, in order to regulate competing uses of public forums, may impose a permit requirement on those wishing to hold a march, a parade, or a rally. Such a scheme, however, must meet certain constitutional requirements and may not delegate overly broad licensing discretion to a government official. Further, any permit scheme controlling the time, place, and manner of speech must not be based on the content of the speech, must be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest, and must leave open ample alternatives for communication. So there's a number of criteria there for when the government can put in place a prior restraint on protected speech in a public forum. And so this would be an example of, I want to go parade down 8th Street, and I'm going to be competing with other uses like traffic, right? And so when can I do that? Well, the courts have said, the government limiting you doing that is a prior restraint. So that is a prior restraint. Having a permit from the government in order to protest is a prior restraint. Typically the rule, and the court says there's a heavy presumption against the validity of prior restraints. The rule is you don't need the government's permission to protest. Like if you leave remembering anything, that's the main thing. But when your activity is going to be competing with other uses of a public forum, then the government can impose those time, place, and manner restrictions. So often those take the form of, if you're going to just act unpermittedly and you're protesting on the sidewalk, well, people have a right to pass on the sidewalk. Blocking the sidewalk, I think, is an offense of some kind. I don't know exactly what the nature of the language is. But so you can protest on the sidewalk, you don't need a permit, but if you start to block the sidewalk, well, then you're competing with another use of the public forum. And that's where it begins to get dicey. But a protest that's just going to use a space without competing with other uses of the space, the government can't say, oh, you forgot to give a permit for that. It's like, how am I competing with other uses of the space? Right? So by holding a march, parade, or rally, those are areas often where you're going to be completely using up a space. In this case, the case came out of this county in Georgia where it's a like 99% white county in Georgia, and civil rights groups went and protested there, and there were fairly large altercations between different groups of demonstrators, and so the county then imposed this, hey, we're going to charge you for your permit fee based on our theory of how much the demonstration is going to cost us. How much is it going to cost us to maintain public order for your demonstration? And the court said, well, you can't do that. because it puts too much discretion on the government official. So that's one of the criteria for what makes a prior restraint unconstitutional or constitutional in this context of protecting speech in public forum, is the way that the government officials decide who gets to use it, who doesn't get to use it, can't be discretionary. So whoever applies for the 4th of July parade, oh, that's the 4th of July parade, we all love the 4th of July parade, no problem. Oh, the KKK comes to Port Angeles. You know, we hope that we don't get the same response. Oh, the 4th of July parade, oh, yeah, state parade route, go ahead. But no, the government needs to be, not have a discretionary interest in who gets it, who doesn't. And, you know, it goes as far as, you know, hey, there might be a lot more policing required for one of those protests, but that doesn't mean, according to this case, that the government can charge more for the protest that's going to require more police work, or less for the protest that's going to require less police work.
Were you saying that if the KKK were to want to manage a great deal of the 4th of July thing, they could?
Oh, no. Sorry, I didn't mean to
I
say.
know you didn't like it, but I think you were saying they can't get too fussy about who's managing or throwing this event.
Right, I mean, the government isn't supposed to be looking
At the content.
so yeah, I kind of mixed content and discretion there in examples. But yeah, the government can't be looking at the content and say, we're going to allow this because we like the content, or we're not going to allow that because we don't like the content, when deciding who gets a permit and who doesn't get a permit.
So the KKK would be just who's doing it, not necessarily what they're saying?
Well, and that's why I was kind of
Not what-
trying to address the discretion thing of, you know, the government can't say, well, you know, you're our friends, and so we're going to give you a permit, grease the skids, and you're not our friends, so we're not going to give you a permit, that sort of thing. It needs to be. What's that?
That's your point.
Yeah, and in some ways that does go along with the content. You're right, it's a separate issue than the content. But yeah, so these prior restraints need to be content neutral. They can't be based on the content. The government can't have a lot of discretion in who gets through the prior restraint filter, the permitting filter, and who doesn't. The government also needs to have a narrowly tailored interest, that the prior restraint, the permit, needs to be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest. So this is slightly different than strict scrutiny in that it's significant government interest, but you know, there needs to be a significant government interest. So maintaining traffic flow, right? That would count as a significant government interest. And so is the government's restriction, its prior restraint, narrowly tailored to achieve that? Well, yeah, the government's going to say, hey, no, Lindsay, before you march down 8th Street, you need to get a permit so that we can figure out where traffic is going to flow, when, and how we're going to reroute traffic around that speech event, that march, because we have these competing uses of the public forum. It raises this question if 8th Street was already closed and I want to have my march, would there be competing uses? Would I need a permit? And probably technically no, but you know, I'm not sure when 8th Street's closed and it's not a construction site. So, oh, it's a construction site now, right? So, yeah, that's a competing use. And that's one where the government could probably say, actually, we don't allow protests, we don't grant permits in construction sites, period. Right? And so there's significant government interest in safety, and their method is actually we don't allow it. That, you know, and the courts would likely say it's a construction site, you're repairing the 8th Street bridges or whatever, and so, yeah, that's actually okay to just say, no, it's not happening there in that construction site.
So to take that 4th of July example, So let's say that government says, okay, our city council passed an ordinance many years ago that said we should encourage a 4th of July parade every year. And that's all the ordinance says. And beyond that, we feel that closing the streets for any other event is too harmful to public good, and therefore we won't permit any other event. So would something like that meet the test because it's not discriminating on basis of content?
Well, it's tough because there's that one exception in there. You know, if the court said, well, let's take like I-5 in Seattle, right? You know, you want to permit to march and protest, go to the city of Seattle and say, we'd like a permit to protest in I-5. The city's probably going to say, no, we don't grant permits to protest in I-5. Sorry, you can march in the streets, but not on the interstate. And so going back to the test, must be narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest. Well, significant government interest is that's an interstate for a lot of obvious reasons. You know, it would be problematic to protest there. And then the government's interest is just blanket no. Well, I could imagine the court saying, although I haven't seen the case specifically, that, well, that's fine. And one of the things that goes in there is this other requirement, that when the government imposes a prior restraint, they must leave open ample alternatives for communication. So if I-5 was the only street in Seattle, well, then the government couldn't close it to marches and parades. But there's other alternatives. And so, you know, that helps to meet that criteria of saying, well, the construction site, sorry, you can go here, but not there. And that is partly how free speech zones get justified. You know, the courts have said, well, you know, there's yeah, you can't protest right here next to the convention, but you can protest right there, and it's an ample alternative for communication. And so we're going to say that even though this place was off limits to free speech, and that space was, the courts have often upheld the free speech zone concept. So I don't know if I fully answered the question.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying is that if a municipality passed an ordinance like that, saying, okay, only 4th of July, that it could be interpreted as that law was based on the content of the message.
Yeah, we're allowing this one, that's pretty content-based to say, we're allowing this, but not others. There's another mix-up there, which is a government-sponsored event, which might throw a little wrench in the analysis. But yeah, the idea that we're going to favor one event and not favor another event, you know, favor one kind of speech over another kind of speech, that's usually fairly problematic. You know, so yeah, I hope that that's not actually an ordinance on the books. Yeah. So some examples of how this works. On page 3, subsection D, folks were protesting the plights of homeless people in Washington, D.C., their inability to sleep in the parks. The National Park Service had a restriction on camping in the parks. Folks were protesting in Lafayette Park right behind the White House. And the court said that the National Park Service restriction on camping in Lafayette Park was a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction on the protest encampment. So people could protest in their tents. They could feign sleeping as a form of protest concerning homeless people not having a place to sleep. But they couldn't actually sleep in the tents because that would have been violating the National Park Service restriction on camping. And that came up for a lot of people during the Occupy movement in 2011. Well, these tents in public places and what are you allowed to do, what are you not allowed to do as free speech. Because free speech also includes expression, right? Certain forms of expression are speech. Certain hand gestures convey a lot, often more than words, and that sort of thing. And so, speech can be both verbal and it can also be expressive. All right. So another example.
The entire problem down with the homeless people was sleep is not expressive, not verbal. So
I think that's how the court rationalized it. I didn't reread that entire case. So Clark versus Community for Creative Nonviolence, that'll explain exactly how the court cut the difference there. But the court upheld the National Park Service restriction as not violating their free speech rights.
So this business with the tent in the square, is that conduct that communicates? Is that what that phrase refers to? And that was on the first page.
Oh, yeah. So that less protected speech, conduct that communicates. It's a whole other area of, when is conduct, when are nonverbal expressions protected speech and when are they not? And, you can slice that all sorts of ways.
So it needs nonverbal in that case.
Yeah, so erecting a tent on public property on its own might just be trespassing and camping in violation of National Park Service regulation. On the other hand, it could be an act of protest, and the context and all that is going to play a role there as to whether it's even speech at all, or if it's just less protected speech, or is it protected political speech. So another example, E on page 3, this is Hill versus Colorado from 2000, U.S. Supreme Court case. Colorado had enacted a statute that said that people entering healthcare facilities cannot be approached knowingly within 8 feet of them in order to leaflet the person entering the healthcare facility, display a sign at that person, or engage in oral protest, education, and counseling. This was obviously aimed at protests outside of clinics that provided abortions, and this was the statute intended to prevent people from getting in the faces of patients as they were going into those facilities. And the U.S. Supreme Court upheld that statute, and basically there was a reasonable time, place, and manner restriction. The court was saying that people who are entering healthcare facilities can be in a vulnerable psychological state, and they shouldn't be, they shouldn't have somebody right in their face protesting them as they're entering that facility. There's some controversial dissents in that opinion, as you might imagine. Another one that's even more recent is page 3, subsection F, Snyder versus Phelps. This is one of the cases from the Westboro Baptist Church. Is that the name of it?
Yes.
Yes.
That's a good one.
And these are folks who were protesting military funerals with very offensive signs, and so one of the parents of the deceased soldier sued some of the church members, and that case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2011. And the people were protesting 1,000 feet away from the funeral. They were on public property. They were on a public forum. They had to comply with all the applicable time, place, and manner restrictions. And so this is what Chief Justice Roberts said. Speech at a public place on a matter of public concern is entitled to special protection under the First Amendment. Such speech cannot be restricted simply because it is upsetting or arouses contempt. If there is a bedrock principle underlying the First Amendment, it is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. Indeed, the point of all speech protection is to shield just those choices of content that in someone's eyes are misguided or even hurtful. So it's not just speech for the speech we like, but if we go back to the first page, I put in famous quote about the First Amendment, which is that it protects freedom for the thought that we hate.
Question, my recollection, this was about the gay issue. Yeah, so.
Well, they made it about.
They made it about the gay issue, but my question is, that's not a public, that's not, that's a sexual issue. It's not, I mean, I understand that it's very, entered the mainstream as a hot issue, I get that. But it doesn't have the same gravitas to me as, say, issues on war or, say, having tax objections to certain actions of the judge. You understand what I'm saying?
So
it's
you
making, elevating this issue to something of considerable weight.
That they're saying that it was political, I mean, the majority in Snyder versus Phelps is saying, well, that was political speech,
And therefore,
as opposed to perhaps less protected speech on sexual matters. Yeah, I mean, I don't remember if anyone in the dissent said that, but yeah, that's one way you can slice it, is say, well, actually, that's not political speech that gets the highest level of protection, that's less protected speech. Yeah, and the court could have gone there. I think it gets back to some of those questions of like how judges make decisions and why. Yeah. But you're right. I mean, that's one way to slice the analysis and come to a different conclusion if the judges had wanted to. So at the bottom of page 3, we've been in the last probably 20, 21 years in a state of the U.S. government, specifically Congress and the executive, using terrorism as a justification for quelling or saying that certain forms of what would otherwise be protected speech are not protected speech. I think you can make some parallels going back to that, the case Schenck versus United States in 1919, where the court saying, well, actually, that's not protected because of the context of the time, because we're in the war on terror. So in the USA Patriot Act, there's a definition for domestic terrorism, and I've ellipsed some of the sections, but left one of the variants of that definition, which is that domestic terrorism is activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or of any state and appear to be intended to influence the policy of the government by intimidation or coercion. So protesting, peaceably assembling, the redress of grievances. Redressing the grievances is influencing the policy of the government. Okay? And I have heard law enforcement officials say that the act of civil disobedience, like say somebody might sit down on a train on the train tracks, well, that is an act dangerous to human life. Whose life?
Oh, yeah.
The person sitting on the tracks, well, it's still an act dangerous to human life. I'm serious. In depositions, I've heard law enforcement officers reason this way. And of course, sitting on railroad tracks is a violation of criminal laws in the United States. So really the only thing you're missing is influence the policy of the government by intimidation or coercion. But I mean, aren't those civil disobedience protesters trying to intimidate and coerce the government to change its policies? I mean, so a lot of people have been raising concerns that domestic terrorism, as it can be defined, encompasses a lot of protest activities. And what folks have been seeing, the examples at Standing Rock are a fantastic example, but it's been very prevalent in climate justice movements, but also now in movements where people are protesting in urban settings with the economic terrorism bills that a number of states have been considering, this idea of protesting as terrorism. And I represent some clients who have been labeled domestic terrorists because of their protest activities. So it's a real concern, and it's there in federal law, and a number of law enforcement officers, not all of them certainly, but there are enough law enforcement officers who tend to think this way that it forms a problem. There's also private security, often for, say, oil and gas companies in the context of the climate justice protests, who go into smaller law enforcement jurisdictions and say, hey, the terrorists are coming, let us tell you some ways that you can convict them on higher terrorism-related charges. If you search online, terrorism hoax glitter, you'll find a case out of Central Plains where some activists unfurled a banner, there was some glitter that came down from it, and the prosecution said that was a terrorism hoax, which is a felony, and they were impersonating a terrorist attack because that glitter came off their banner. Fortunately those charges were dropped, but it's a sort of example that comes out of a state of mind framing that analogizes protest to terrorism. And so we've got that in the Patriot Act. We also have a really important case at the very bottom of page 3 called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. And in this case, the Humanitarian Law Project and some other organizations were looking at going to Turkey, going to Sri Lanka, and teaching groups in those places, specifically the Kurdish People's Party and the Tamil Tigers, about how to use United Nations dispute resolution processes and other kind of international court processes to try to peacefully resolve their disputes with their respective governments. Humanitarian Law Project, right? Like that's the name. Like, hey, these are violent altercations between these different groups and their governments. They're considered terrorist organizations by the United States government, but these folks wanted to teach them how to use nonviolent methods of dispute resolution, like United Nations stuff. And before they did that, they had this case with the United States Supreme Court and basically asked, hey, would we be criminal for doing that? Because under the USA Patriot Act, there's another clause that criminalizes material support of terrorism. Would this be material support of terrorism? By going and teaching people about nonviolent dispute resolution methods. And the US Supreme Court said yes.
What?
That's terrorism because that frees that terrorist organization's resources up to do terrorism somewhere else. So you're giving them resources to pursue United Nations dispute resolution methods. Well, that allows them to use other resources for terrorism. So this case, if anyone did the homework from the very first lecture on the the Washington versus Trump. So Washington versus Trump, where the state of Washington and the state of Minnesota sued the federal government over the executive order, the Muslim ban, right? And it went up to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. If you read the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision in Washington versus Trump, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project is the case that the U.S. government is citing for its justification. And the Ninth Circuit said, no, we disagree in the context of the Muslim ban, but in this context of using international dispute resolution methods or training people on how to use that, when those people are labeled domestic terrorists, the U.S. Supreme Court has said that, no, that would be material support of terrorism.
Normally, when you criminalize something, you have to have the mens rea, you have to have criminal intent, destructive intent, right?
You're right. So there's this mental state requirement for you can't, for most criminal acts. And I think if you look at material support of terrorism, there's a knowing provision in there. So the mens rea is knowing. Yeah, but you have to double check 18 USC 23390. And so just put that in a website search and you'll get that statute. But yeah, so the Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, some folks have said is kind of the furthest extent that the courts have gone with the national security threat justification by the federal government. But it's an important case to note, and it is current today, for example, in Washington versus Trump. At the bottom of page 3 is a resource that looks at how police have constrained protests in the United States, policing political speech. It looked at a couple of mass protests maybe about 10 years ago or so. And that's a resource that people want to look at. Well, what do the police do in regard to preemptive arrests, in regard to using tear gas, pepper spray, sound cannons, concussion grenades, those sorts of things against protesters, and some of the mechanisms of it. It's a long report, but I thought it was a useful thing for the context of what we're talking about. I apologize that we're not getting to the section about privacy protections, but I want to run through these resources really fast. A lot of this is the sort of thing to take home and study on your own. We have rights of privacy in relation to the government investigating us, and those rights are found in the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, and also in some analogous Washington Constitution clauses. So I'm on page 4 at the top. The thing is, those rights, you don't have them until you invoke them. You don't. It's not like, oh, I'm going to wait for the officer to read my Miranda rights and then I'm going to stop talking. No. Everything you say can be used against you. And you really have to invoke your right to silence. So there's some key phrases. So 5D at the bottom, these are the things to kind of know in practice, because, I don't know, it can happen anyway. And so am I free to go in the context of walking down the sidewalk, you're talking to a law enforcement officer, you'd rather not be in a conversation, am I free to go? That helps establish whether you can leave or not. If you're being searched and you don't want to be searched, don't physically interfere with the search, but say, I don't consent to a search. And then if you're being asked questions by a law enforcement officer or a government agent, the lying to a law enforcement officer is itself a crime, so you don't lie, right? You can choose to tell the truth if you want, but often, depending on the investigative circumstance of what's going on, it's all circumstantial. One of the best things to say is, I'm going to remain silent, I want to see a lawyer. That's kind of like a Harry Potter spell, right? You just cast a spell, I'm going to remain silent, I want to see a lawyer, and you've created this spell. And in theory, law enforcement officers should stop asking questions. In practice, it's not always the case, so you just keep casting that spell. I'm going to remain silent. I want to see a lawyer, and yeah. And it's very contextual. So I'm not saying you should do that when you get pulled over and you're like, oh shit, I'm pretty sure I was speeding. No, you're in a vehicle, show your license, registration, proof of insurance, and keep your hands visible. But if the officer then is like, hey, can I look in the trunk? That's when I would be saying, this isn't a normal traffic stop anymore. Right? And I would say, I don't consent to a search, and begin to invoke my rights. Right? But it's contextual for each person, where you are, what you're doing, the psychology of the interaction between you and the officer. So I'm not going to give like that's what you do in every circumstance. So those are the three phrases to figure out how to invoke your rights, because you don't have them unless you assert them. And I guess I'll move into the resources. We're going to go over a little bit of time, but I think it's important to get through this. 5D on the back page, there's several resources here to get into more detail. The immigrant defense, that talks specifically about immigration and custody enforcement arrests, and the context there, which is slightly different than normal law enforcement, but important to know about. The general primer is NLG, that's National Lawyers Guild.org, Know Your Rights. That's a 16-page booklet. I highly recommend it. It's kind of the crash course in this. And it's not the sort of thing that you can be like, oh, excuse me, officer, let me see what I'm supposed to do in this context. No, read it over, recommend that people read it. If you want to practice these things. And I think the gist of it is, it's not that, oh, well, I got something to hide that I need to assert my right to remain silent, my right to see a lawyer, my right to privacy by not consenting to a search. But as one of the other resources on this last page, 6D says, right now there are 37,000 pages of federal criminal law. the record. 37,000 pages of federal criminal law. The prosecutors with the United States Attorney's Office do not know all of those laws, right? And so it's not so much a question, and this is what the article on 6D talks about, it's not so much a question of who's breaking the law, as it is a question of who becomes a suspect. Because if any of us become a suspect, we're breaking the law. There's something we've done, whether knowingly or not, that's in violation of one of those 37,000 pages of federal criminal law. And so when you're in the situation where it's not so much who's breaking the law as who becomes worth investigating, then your decisions about privacy, particularly if you're involved in protesting, are important decisions that aren't decisions you make because you are like, well, I've got something to hide, I need to do this, but rather because you are more likely to become a suspect, and you have a right to remain private and keep that privacy unto yourself. So one quick thing about cell phones is you should have them password protected, just like your computer. You should have them encrypted, which is not that complex a process, but it's worth doing. And don't have just a thumb activation, because that's not a search. Make sure it's a PIN, or even better, a passphrase. And then if it's at the airport, there's a whole different set of things. So when you're boarding TSA, don't say I don't consent to a search when you're boarding TSA. Right? If you didn't consent to the search, don't go through TSA. Right? Same thing with the border. Like, the border and TSA are special scenarios. So read over those know your rights stuff there before saying, aha, I don't consent to a search with the TSA officer, because you're not getting on the plane if you do that. So in terms of device security, this is a whole important area that I highly recommend people looking into. One thing is with text messages. There's an app called Signal. It's produced by Open Whisper Systems. It is something that almost everyone who looks at security issues from a technology perspective is recommending. Because normally with technology, there's like this trade-off. There's convenience and there's security, and as you get more convenient, it becomes less secure, and as you get more secure, it becomes less convenient, and pretty soon you're like, I can't even communicate with anyone if I really want to be super secure. And so that's this trade-off. But with Signal, it's kind of like both things are great. It's really easy, and it's really secure. So on your smartphone, especially in the back, do you have Signal installed on that?
I was looking it up.
No, behind you. So install Signal on your app, and then get your friends to do it as well, because it's end-to-end encrypted. Doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's not in your device doing a keystroke tracking, but it does mean that that communication is end-to-end encrypted. And you can have disappearing messages. It's a very good app from the perspective of privacy. 6D, basic device security, things like putting in a passphrase, encrypting your device. That Let's Get Safe website covers all those things. And then 6C is kind of more advanced stuff, things like encrypted email and that sort of thing. But that ssd.eff.org is Surveillance Self-Defense Handbook by the Electronic Frontier Foundation. So I'd suggest those things for kind of more advanced device security. So finally, and so I'm sorry for kind of skipping over the privacy thing, but hopefully I think in the context of looking at how the First Amendment is applied over time, during times of war like World War I, or during the war on terrorism like we're in now, the reasons for thinking about privacy in our communication are in some ways self-evident. That it's not a matter, and the article Why I Have Nothing to Hide is the wrong way to think about security, addresses this really well. But it's not a matter of saying, well, I'm not doing anything wrong, so why should I be concerned? Because there's a lot more to be concerned about that we don't even know is out there. So I put at the bottom a number of organizing resources. These are in no way comprehensive. They're things that, since we're talking about protesting and privacy, it makes sense to talk about how those things happen more effectively. And I think these are resources that I would recommend as learning more about the acts of being an organizer or a protester or an activist. There's useful things here. One of my favorite essays, which is not law related at all, is on the list, number 7G, which is an essay by Danelle Mehta. She is a systems theorist. This looks at leverage points in systems and how to make changes in systems. So that's not the law at all, but it is probably my favorite essay. And so I put it on the list. I'm proud of this. So I realized that this was a lot in a short period of time. It should have been shorter. And it didn't answer everyone's questions. I mean, the time, place, and manner stuff is confusing and not clear. My advice when you're actually out in the context of a protest is to assert your rights. You don't need somebody's permission to protest. But if a law enforcement officer is saying, no, get back on the sidewalk, or get out of the street, or take that down, or whatever it is, in that context, arguing with the law enforcement officer is not going to get you very far. So practically speaking, the law enforcement officer doesn't decide whether somebody's civil rights have been violated. A judge decides that. So if you think your civil rights are being violated, arguing with the officer is not the way to handle it. Documenting what is happening is a much better way of handling it. In addition to documenting, one thing that you can ask the officer is why. Why can't I do this? I mean, in some contexts you can engage in a discussion, but I'm hesitant to suggest that because of what it means. But the question why, I mean, if an officer can't explain why they're restricting your free speech activities in a public forum, document that. Right? Again, arguing with the officer isn't going to do a lot of good unless you're really looking to get arrested. But asking the question and explaining what's going on and having that documented evidence is how, if your rights were violated in that context, you would potentially be able to seek a remedy with a judge saying, yes, your rights were violated.
Old lesson from the 1960s and 70s in Vietnam War protests. Never argue constitutional law in a street car. Yeah. Never.
So reaffirm, do not argue constitutional law with the street officer. I appreciate all of you being here. I know there were other things going on tonight that were more important perhaps, and so thank you for coming, and I hope this is helpful. And next week, same time, same place, we'll be talking about how corporations got constitutional rights in our system. Thank you.